Ladies and gentlemen, there is something in the human spirit that refuses to rest, something restless, something deeply dissatisfied with the mere given, something that wrestles not only with itself but with the very structure of reality. It is this struggle that defines us. It is the mark of those who are truly alive. And it is ancient. It is biblical. It is the story of Jacob, the one who wrestled with God. Now think about that for a moment, to wrestle with God. What does that mean? What does it mean to struggle against the infinite? To contend with the very source of being itself? This is no trivial metaphor. It is a description of the deepest level of human experience, of the unavoidable confrontation with suffering, meaning, responsibility, and truth. It is the battle we all face, the battle against the chaos that seeks to pull us into meaninglessness, the battle against tyranny, both external and internal, and the battle against our own weaknesses, our own inadequacies, our own self-deceptions. And this is not a battle we can refuse. Life does not allow that. You might think that by turning away, by refusing to engage, by avoiding the difficult questions, you can escape the burden of this struggle. But you can't, because suffering will find you whether you acknowledge it or not. The question is not whether you will struggle, but whether you will do so willingly, whether you will take up the fight with your eyes open, or whether you will be dragged into it kicking and screaming. There is a reason that in the biblical account, Jacob, after wrestling with God, is given a new name, Israel, the one who struggles with God. And that name is not a condemnation, it is an elevation. It is a recognition that to struggle with the deepest questions, to contend with reality in all its terror and majesty, is to be fully human. It is to take up the burden of existence with the dignity and responsibility that is required of us. But let's not pretend this is easy. To wrestle with God means to be willing to confront the deepest truths, even when they terrify us. It means acknowledging the suffering and malevolence in the world, not turning away from it, not pretending it isn't there, but standing before it with courage. It means recognizing our own failures, not in a shallow, self-loathing way, but with the kind of honesty that allows for real transformation. And it means aiming upwards, setting our sights on what is highest, striving towards something better despite the cost. And there is a cost. Of course there is, because to wrestle with God is to be changed. Jacob walks away from his encounter with a limp, forever marked by his struggle. That's the price of truth. It wounds. It reshapes. It demands that you give up the comfortable illusions that once protected you. But what is the alternative? To live in ignorance, to settle for something less than what is real, to avoid the battle and let chaos and suffering dictate the terms of your existence? No. The highest possible good is only found through the struggle, and there is something in us that knows this. It is why we admire those who confront their suffering with courage, why we tell stories of heroes who take on the dragon rather than cower before it, why we are inspired by those who speak the truth even when it costs them everything. Because something in us recognizes that this is the right way to live. This is what we are called to. And so the challenge is before us. Will we take up the burden of our own lives? Will we wrestle with the truth, with meaning, with God Himself? Or will we shrink back, refusing the struggle, choosing comfort over purpose, illusion over reality? The choice is ours, but only one path leads forward, only one path transforms, only one path is worthy of the human soul. The inescapable struggle. There is no escaping the fact that life is a struggle. It is built into the structure of existence itself. To be human is to be caught in an ongoing conflict, not just with the world, not just with society, not just with other people, but with something deeper, something fundamental, something divine. And that is precisely the relationship between God and human beings, a relationship of struggle, of contention, of wrestling. This is one of the most ancient and persistent themes in the history of human thought. You see it in myth, in religion, in philosophy, in literature. The human being is not simply a passive recipient of divine wisdom or grace. That would be too easy. Instead, we are creatures that must strive, that must wrestle with what is highest, that must contend with the structure of reality itself in order to find our place within it. And what exactly are we struggling against? We struggle against suffering, obviously. That is self-evident. Life is hard. It is filled with pain, loss, disappointment, and tragedy. But suffering alone is not the greatest enemy. We also struggle against meaninglessness. We struggle against chaos. We struggle against the overwhelming weight of responsibility. And perhaps, most of all, we struggle against God himself because God represents order, judgment, and the demand for transformation. Think about what it means to truly wrestle with God. It is not the act of rejecting belief, nor is it blind obedience. It is neither submission nor rebellion. It is a confrontation. It is the deeply human act of standing before the highest possible authority and saying, I do not understand. I do not agree. But I will engage. I will struggle. I will not turn away. And that is terrifying, because to truly wrestle with God means exposing yourself to the unbearable weight of truth. It means recognizing your own insufficiency, your own failure, your own potential for both greatness and destruction. It means acknowledging that the world is structured in a way that demands something of you, that expects you to rise to a certain standard. And that is a painful realization, because it means that much of what you are right now is not enough. But here's the thing: you do not get to opt out. That's not how the game is played. You can refuse to wrestle, but that doesn't mean the struggle disappears. It just means you lose by default. Life will impose suffering upon you whether you choose to engage with it or not. The only real choice is whether you face it willingly, whether you engage in the struggle consciously, or whether you allow yourself to be crushed beneath its weight. That is the nature of the relationship between God and human beings. It is not one of comfort. It is not one of ease. It is a test, a challenge, a demand. And the only proper response, the only truly human response, is the occasion and fight. Wrestling with reality. Reality is not something you simply accept. It's something you have to confront. It's something you have to wrestle with, something that will break you if you approach it passively, as if it owes you comfort or ease. It doesn't. Reality is brutal. It is filled with suffering, malevolence, and chaos. It does not care for your illusions, and it does not bend to your wishes. And so the question is, what do you do when you come face to face with that? This is the essence of the human struggle. It is the confrontation between what is and what could be, between what you are and what you must become. And at the deepest level, it is the struggle between humanity and God, because God, in every meaningful sense, represents the structure of reality itself. God is order. God is the principle that defines what is true and what is false. God is the voice that calls you forward, that demands that you aim higher, that refuses to let you remain in comfortable ignorance. And that's a terrifying thing, because it means that the world is structured in a way that requires something from you. And people don't like that. They want reality to be simple. They want it to be fair. They want it to accommodate their desires rather than challenge them. But that's not how it works. Instead, reality places obstacles in your path. It confronts you with suffering. It presents you with terrible injustices. It shows you your own inadequacy, and your response to that, your willingness to wrestle with it rather than turn away, is what defines you. And this is why people have always wrestled with God, not because they reject him, but because they refuse to accept easy answers, because they know deep down that the truth is more complicated than they would like it to be. And because they understand that to truly encounter the divine, to truly engage with what is most real, is to risk everything. Your old beliefs, your old identity, your old way of being. Think about what happens when you genuinely struggle with an idea, when you take it seriously rather than dismissing it out of hand. It forces you to change. It forces you to let go of what is weak, what is false, what is no longer sufficient. That's painful. That's why people resist it. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is stagnation. The alternative is decay. The alternative is living a life so detached from reality that it collapses the moment it encounters something truly difficult. And so the question is not whether you will wrestle with reality. You will. Everyone does. The question is whether you will do so honestly, whether you will take up the challenge willingly, even when it hurts, even when it demands something of you, because that is the only way forward. That is the only way to grow. That is the only way to become something more than you are. The burden of responsibility. Responsibility is not something you take on lightly. It's not something trivial. It's weight, real weight, the kind that crushes you if you ignore it and defines you if you bear it properly. And this is something that human beings have always wrestled with, because responsibility isn't just a social expectation or a cultural construct. It is fundamental to existence itself. It is, in a very real sense, the price we pay for being conscious, for being aware of ourselves, for being capable of choice. And at the deepest level, it is the point of conflict between human beings and God. Because what does God represent? God represents judgment. God represents the structure of reality itself. God represents the voice that calls you to be more than you are. And that is not an easy thing to face. It is a terrifying thing, because if you truly accept responsibility, you have no excuse. You can't blame the world for your failures. You can't hide behind ignorance. You can't pretend that things are meaningless just to escape the effort required to make them meaningful. And people run from that. They run from it in a million ways. They avoid responsibility by blaming others, by indulging in resentment, by choosing cynicism over action. They seek refuge in ideology and the false certainty of simplistic narratives that absolve them of personal effort. They even reject God, not because they don't believe, but because they are afraid of what it would mean if they did. Because if God is real, then responsibility is real. And if responsibility is real, then every moment of your life is a moral choice. Every action you take matters. Every failure is your failure. And that is an unbearable thought for those who refuse to carry the weight of their own existence. But there's a paradox here. The thing that people flee from responsibility is the very thing that gives life meaning. Because what happens when you take on responsibility willingly? You become stronger. You become more competent. You become more real. And you stop being a victim of circumstance. You stop seeing yourself as something small and powerless, tossed around by forces beyond your control. Instead, you become the kind of person who can face suffering, who can endure hardship, who can hold the world on their shoulders without collapsing. And this is something deeply embedded in our traditions and our stories. Look at the greatest figures in history. They were not people who avoided responsibility. They were people who took it on often at immense personal cost. Look at the biblical figures. Moses didn't want to lead his people, but he did. Christ bore the sins of the world, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. This is what God calls people to do, to take up their cross, to bear the burden, to accept the suffering, and to make something of it. And so the choice is clear. Will you take on the responsibility that life demands of you? Or will you run from it, hoping that avoidance will somehow shield you from suffering? Because the truth is, suffering is inescapable. The only real question is whether you will face it with purpose, or whether it will destroy you. The transformational cost. Transformation is not something that happens by accident. It's not something that comes easily. It is not a gift freely given. It is earned. And it is earned through suffering, through struggle, through sacrifice. This is one of the fundamental truths of existence. One that human beings have always known. One that is embedded in our deepest stories and traditions. And it is, at its core, the defining struggle between human beings and God. Because what does God demand? Growth. And what is growth? It is the painful process of shedding what is weak, what is insufficient, what is no longer capable of carrying you forward. It is the process of dying to who you were so that you can become something more. And that is not an easy thing to accept. People want to change, but they don't want to pay the price. They want to be better, but they don't want to give up what is holding them back. They want to wrestle with God, but they don't want to walk away with a limp. And yet, that is the cost. That is always the cost. Look at the story of Jacob. He wrestles with God, and when the struggle is over, he is not the same. He is given a new name, Israel, the one who struggles with God and prevails. But he does not walk away unscathed. His hip is wrenched. He is wounded. He carries the mark of his struggle for the rest of his life. And that is the price of transformation. Because to truly confront what is highest, to truly engage with the divine, is to be broken and remade in the process. And people resist that. Of course they do. Because it means letting go of the parts of themselves that are weak and inadequate. It means confronting their own limitations, their own failures, their own moral shortcomings. It means acknowledging that much of what they believe, much of what they value, much of what they cling to is insufficient. And that is terrifying. It is painful. It is humiliating. But what is the alternative? To remain as you are, to refuse the struggle, to avoid the cost and live in comfortable stagnation. That is not a life worth living. That is not a path forward. That is not what God wants for you. Because the highest good is not found in comfort. It is found in challenge. It is found in difficulty. It is found in the painful but necessary process of becoming something more than you are. And the people who truly understand this, the people who take on the burden of transformation willingly, are the ones who shape the world. They are the ones who inspire others. They are the ones who carry forward the great traditions of humanity, who lift up what is noble and true, who bear the responsibility that others refuse to take. And so the question is simple. Will you pay the price? Will you accept the suffering required for transformation? Will you wrestle with God, knowing that you will not walk away the same? Or will you refuse, clinging to the illusion of safety, avoiding the cost, and remaining forever less than what you could be? Because that choice that sacrifices the price of meaning itself. The alternative is worse. People often think that avoiding struggle will make their lives easier, that if they just turn away from responsibility, from truth, from the difficult path, they can somehow escape suffering. But that's a lie. It's a lie we tell ourselves to justify inaction, to excuse weakness, to avoid the weight of existence. And the reality is that the alternative, the refusal to struggle, to wrestle, to confront, is far, far worse. Because what happens when you refuse to wrestle with God, with truth, with reality itself? You don't get peace, you don't get security, you don't get happiness, you get something much darker. You get weakness, you get bitterness, you get despair, because suffering doesn't go away just because you pretend it doesn't exist. It festers, it grows, it consumes. And if you don't take up the burden willingly, life will impose it upon you in ways you cannot control. And this is something ancient people understood deeply. It's why the story of the fall in Genesis is so powerful. Adam and Eve are given paradise, but it comes with responsibility. It comes with a structure. It comes with a demand to act properly, to follow a moral order, to contend with the world as it is. And what do? They try to take a shortcut. They grasp at knowledge before they have earned it, before they are ready for it, before they have struggled for it. And what is the consequence? They are cast out. They are thrown into a world of suffering, of hardship, of toil. That is the price of trying to evade responsibility. That is the price of taking the easy way out. And we see this everywhere. We see it in individuals who refuse to take charge of their own lives, who reject discipline, who run from difficulty. They don't become freer. They become lost. They become resentful. They become ruled by forces they refuse to understand. We see it in societies that abandon truth, that reject responsibility in favor of comfort and expedience. They don't become utopias, they decay, they crumble under their own corruption and weakness. Because here's the brutal reality: if you don't wrestle with God, if you don't struggle with truth, with responsibility, with what is highest, then you will be dominated by something else. You will be ruled by fear, by chaos, by tyranny, both internal and external, and this is not speculation. This is history. This is human nature. This is the pattern we have seen play out over and over again, from the individual to the collective. So what is the choice then? It is not between struggle and ease. It is between meaningful suffering and meaningless suffering. It is between taking up the burden, voluntarily accepting the cost, engaging with the battle of existence, or being crushed under a weight you refuse to acknowledge. And so the alternative is worse. The refusal to struggle does not free you. It enslaves you. The refusal to wrestle with God does not bring peace. It brings despair. The only real path forward, the only path for the human soul, is to engage, to contend, to fight. Because the only thing more terrifying than the struggle itself is what happens when you refuse to face it. The highest calling. There is a fundamental question at the core of human existence. What should you aim at? What should you strive toward? And this is not a trivial question. It is, in fact, the most important question. Because without an aim, without a direction, without something to reach for, you are lost. You drift. You collapse into chaos. And that is not just a psychological reality, it is a moral and existential one. And so, what is the highest calling? What is the thing that justifies the suffering of life? What is the goal so meaningful, so profound, that it makes all of this worthwhile? Well, people have answered this question in different ways throughout history, but at the deepest level, across all cultures, across all traditions, one answer emerges: the highest calling is to strive toward what is most true, to aim at what is most real, to wrestle with God himself and emerge transformed. And that is no easy task, because God, however you understand that concept, is not just a figure of mercy and love. He is also the embodiment of judgment, of order, of the terrifying demand to be more than you are. And when you genuinely confront that, when you take it seriously, it is overwhelming. Because it means that everything you do matters. It means that every decision you make has weight. It means that your actions, your words, your thoughts, your failures are being measured against an ideal so high, so unattainable that you can never truly reach it. And that is frightening. That is why people turn away. That is why people reject the call to be more. Because to take responsibility at the highest level, to aim at the highest good, is to subject yourself to relentless scrutiny. It is to recognize every one of your flaws, every one of your inadequacies, and it is to acknowledge in the deepest possible sense that you are not yet what you could be, that you are not yet who you should be. But what is the alternative? To aim at nothing, to allow yourself to become weak, bitter, resentful, to collapse into nihilism because you are too afraid to confront what is highest. That is not an escape. That is damnation. And we know this. We see it in our own lives. We see it in history. The greatest horrors, the greatest evils are not committed by those who strive toward the good. They are committed by those who abandon it, by those who reject the struggle, by those who refuse to bear the responsibility of existence. And so the highest calling is to take on that burden voluntarily, to stand up straight, to lift your eyes, to aim toward the good even when it is painful, even when it is difficult, even when it requires sacrifice. Because that is what redeems life, that is what justifies suffering, that is what makes you into someone capable of facing the world with strength and dignity. And so the choice is clear. Will you wrestle with God? Will you take on the highest possible responsibility? Will you strive with everything you have toward what is most true? Or will you turn away, pretend it doesn't matter, and allow yourself to become something less than what you were meant to be? Because the highest calling is not comfort, it is not ease, it is the struggle itself. And the only real question is whether you will rise to meet it. And so the question remains, what will you do? Because this is not an abstract discussion. This is not just philosophy. This is your life, right here, right now. You are in a battle whether you acknowledge it or not. You are wrestling with God, with truth, with suffering, with responsibility. And there is no escaping that. You can turn away, sure. You can reject the burden. You can convince yourself that none of this matters, that you don't have to aim higher, that you don't have to struggle. But you will pay the price for that choice. You will sink into resentment. You will become weak. You will suffer not because life is unfair, but because you refuse to bear its necessary weight. Or you can choose differently. You can step forward voluntarily. You can stand up and face the chaos. You can take responsibility not because it's easy, not because it's comfortable, but because it is the only thing powerful enough to bring order out of the void. That is what transforms you. That is what makes you strong. That is what justifies the suffering of existence itself. And so the choice is before you as it always has been. Will you wrestle with God? Will you contend with what is highest, even if it breaks you, even if it leaves you scarred? Or will you shrink away, pretending the struggle isn't real, hiding in weakness and despair? Because in the end, there is no neutrality. There is no avoiding the fight. There is only victory or defeat. And the world, your life, your soul depends on which you choose.